The Oregon Trail was a product of Manifest Destiny, the nationalizing movement of Western expansion that swept over America in the 1800s. American fascination with the Trans-Mississippi West generated a route followed by immigrants from its start in Independence, Missouri to its end in Willamette, Oregon, from 1841 to 1866. Hundreds of thousands of Americans deserted their homes and loved ones to travel the trails in hopes of finding wealth, land, and happiness in Oregon country. However, the 129-day trip bestowed deprivation, isolation, suffering, death, hunger, and violence upon the immigrants. The hardships that these Americans faced were incredibly demanding both physically and mentally, and verify the strength it took to overcome the harshness of the trail. The southwest corner of Courthouse Square of Independence, Missouri marked the jumping-off spot, or starting point, to the Oregon Trail. Independence offered travelers supplies that were necessary to reach Oregon, such as wagons, food, clothing, animals, tools, and camping supplies. Reasons to travel west were many. The Depression of 1837 had created shrunken markets, bank foreclosures, and introduced low wages for workers. The Depression gave Americans a motive to travel west, escape poverty, and obtain some land and make some money. Other immigrants felt that it was an American destiny to capture and tame the West, whereas some fell victim to relentlessness and wanted adventure that led them far away from their status quo. All of the Americans who traveled the Oregon Trail, however, submitted to the someplace all theory, as well as Oregon fever, which both suggested that the unsettled West, specifically Oregon, was a utopia where Americans could get rich and achieve lifelong happiness in a disease-free, perfect climate. Robert Stewart of Astoria was the first person to travel the exact trail in 1812 to 1813, paving the way for other Oregon-bound travelers. He traveled west to east, discovering the South Pass, named because it was south of the route that Lewis and Clark followed through the Continental Divide, and was incredibly imperative for Oregon Trail travelers in later decades. The Bidwell-Barlson Party was the first immigrant party to successfully travel the Oregon Trail. Success stories sparked the Great Migration of 1843, where thousands of immigrants began their journey westward. Travelers were called immigrants while they were on their journey, and pioneers once they had settled. Contrary to many beliefs, the infamous Oregon Trail was not really a trail, but rather a huge cluster of people traveling in the same direction. Immigrants did not follow one another single file. Instead, to avoid the dust coming from wagons ahead of them, travelers would span 4 to 5 miles across the prairie and then congregate together at night. The Oregon Trail was known as the family trail, and typically most families traveled in or alongside wagons. Families used a wagon nicknamed the Prairie Schooner that stood 10 feet tall and weighed about 1,300 pounds. Wagons of families traveled in parties which set up codes, resolutions, and bylaws prior to traveling in order to alleviate conflict while on the trail. A hardship that immigrants faced even before beginning their journey was determining what items were necessities and what were luxuries. Equipment to repair the wagon and to maintain the animals were obviously essential. Food, cooking, utensils, water, clothing, and weaponry were also vital in the success of the journey. Luxury items such as furniture, Bibles, books, and lanterns were classified as leave-her-right or leave-her-right-there items that travelers were forced to desert alongside the trail, realizing that they were merely excess weight to be carried. With their wagons packed, all the immigrants had to do was make the journey to Oregon safely and efficiently. This, however, proved to be a much more difficult task than anticipated. Immigrants faced harsh weather conditions, disease, boredom, physical exhaustion, isolation, and conflicts with Indians throughout their journey west. However, these were just the major difficulties presented to the travelers. The mundane tasks of cooking, cleaning, hunting, and finding the will to survive were just as difficult. It is easy to assume that these hardships were manageable and consistent throughout the voyage, but they were not. Immigrants had to travel through 4 different regions and climates to reach Oregon, which meant that they had challenges that faced them throughout the journey were specific to the area in which they were in. Also, gender roles were maintained in Oregon Trail, so hardships for women differed from those for men. The initial hardship was deciding to leave home, friends and family, and everything else to head west. For many of these immigrants, the only contact with loved ones would be through letters, because a journey so extensive would not be made simply to visit. As travelers left Independence and Missouri's river bottomlands, they entered the Great Plains region. The Great Plains was described as the debris apron and was divided into 2 sections, the low plains and the high plains. Heavy sediment from wind erosion was typical in the low plains and created deep deposits that wagon wheels would get wedged in. Streams were deeply eroded by unstable soil, which made stream crossing incredibly difficult because the wheels would slip quite easily. Except for along large streams, the low plains were treeless, which meant that there was no wood to start a fire. Not only did this hinder a woman's ability to cook, but also meant that there was no source of heat available to dry clothes after a storm or heat a campsite during a chilly night. Clothing, which was typically sewn by women, was insufficient from protecting immigrants against harsh winds and storms. Warm and waterproof jackets were rare, but if a family was lucky enough to have material to sew on, it was reserved for the man. Women and children normally had light shawls or jackets to protect them from the cold. There were no buffalo, and hunting was next to impossible because of the barren conditions. Even the Kansas Indians, who were conditioned to the land, were forced to hunt off their territory to acquire food. Upon leaving the low plains, the immigrants ventured into the high plains, the outliers of the Rocky Mountains. Although there was buffalo and other game to hunt, stream crossing was even more difficult because of shallow waters with sandy bottoms in which wagon wheels would get stuck. Tremendous strength was required to get across streams in the high plains, which led many immigrants to rethink the amount and the necessity of items in their wagons. Fording a stream was also difficult for the immigrants themselves because typically they were walking alongside the wagon, not in it. Drowning was a threat to all walking travelers. Another hardship that presented itself in the high plains was maintaining livestock. Traveling in such a wide open space made it difficult to safely control and direct the livestock. The high plains also had very little trees, so travelers substituted buffalo dung for wood, which took some getting used to. Lastly, the humidity shrank the wagon's wheels, which then led to stalled wagons. Once the immigrants reached Fort Laramie, they had left the plains and entered the Rockies. The Rocky Mountain region had steep soil, ascents and descents, and very little plant life. The starkly different conditions of the Rockies placed different challenges upon the immigrants. Rocky soil and even uneven terrain was hard on wagon wheels and animal hooves. When wagon wheels were unstable, there was a chance that walkers alongside the wagon could get maimed or possibly even run over by the massive wheels. As immigrants continued to travel, there was also a greater risk of disease affecting them. Cholera, which had no cure at the time, was detrimental to many on the Oregon Trail. If a loved one died, they were usually abandoned in a ditch on the side of the trail and later dug up by the animals. Bodies and scattered bones were not appealing to the latter travelers, but were a consequence of life on the trail. Once they left the Rocky Mountains, immigrants entered the Columbian Plateau, where water was difficult to get because of the canyon walls along the streams, and buffalo and other game were practically non-existent. The lack of food proved to be a problem not only for the immigrants, but also for the starving Indians that lived within the Columbian Plateau. And immigrants' horses and cattle enticed hungry Indians and led to Indian attacks. At first, Indians would shoot arrows at the cattle in hopes that they would die and become abandoned. However, once Indians obtained guns, they would shoot directly at a wagon and steal goods and livestock from the immigrants. Another extreme hardship was the woman's responsibility to cook and clean while still looking after the kids. Besides the basic equipment and ingredients a woman brought along, she was expected to make hot meals from the elements provided to her. Sanitation was another problem because water, if there was any, had to be boiled to assure cleanliness. Women had to modify their tasks to the environment along the trail, which usually was not very adaptable or civilized. After leaving the Columbian Plateau, travelers went through the rugged Cascade Mountains and entered their final destination, Willamette Valley, which was damp and dim and covered with red cedar trees and moss. Although a sense of accomplishment and relief was obviously enlightening, some immigrants who were already exhausted from traveling became sick from all the dampness. After arriving, immigrants wasted little time to find land and work, create homes, and start new lives. The hardships they faced along the Oregon Trail enabled some of these pioneers to strive for a better life and to find satisfaction in trusting manifest destiny, as well as in their decision to travel west. Others, however, worn down from the hardships they faced while on the trail, had little confidence and willpower left when they arrived in Oregon, making it difficult to find a better life in a very different environment. All of the immigrants that traveled on the Oregon Trail, however, are recognized today as the true pioneers of the West.